Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this symposium. We'll be getting going in a few minutes. I'm Ik Ho Lim. I'm Director for Trade and Environment, and I'm your moderator for this opening panel. Great pleasure to have with us this morning a very distinguished panel. We have, let me start with my left, our Deputy Director General, Jean-Marie Pogam. We have also the Ambassador for the United States, Maria Pagan. We have as well Ambassador of Uruguay, Jose Luis Chancela Gomez. And on my right, I have Ambassador of Singapore, Tan Hung Seng. So it's really a star-studded panel that we have for the Tbt Committee. We're normally not used to this in the Tbt Committee, but this is great to have all of you here. And I think this points to the importance of the issue that we are addressing this morning through this panel. As you know, the symposium is on easing regulatory bottlenecks. So the theme itself suggests that we're looking at the balance between regulation and trade, and particularly in the context of supply chains, and in particular, the role that the WTO can play to ease regulatory bottlenecks, especially in promoting greater international cooperation. So this theme, I think, is close to the hearts of many people because, you know, regulation is needed to keep people safe, healthy, preserve the environment, promote sustainability, and achieve many other public policy goals. And at the same time, WTO is, of course, very interested and has a very clear goal to facilitate trade. So the question comes, how do we do both? Have the correct balance of regulation, and at the same time ensure that the trading system itself contributes to the achievement of the many public policy goals that I've already cited. Now, this area of work is not necessarily new as such. Of course, we have the Tbt Agreement, we have the Tbt Committee, which does this with the delegations in, I would say, one of the most busiest parts of work at the WTO. So hopefully through this panel, we will get more insights on the current issues that we face, as well as some pathways towards making the work of the WTO as relevant as possible in this intersection between regulation and trade. So I will pass the floor on for opening remarks to Deputy Director General Jean-Marie Pogam, and then we will go through the other panelists. So thank you very much. Jean-Marie, please.
Thank you, Director. Thank you all. Excellencies, ambassadors, dear colleagues, and ladies and gentlemen. I'd just like to challenge you into imagining, for a start, a multilateral trading system which is providing effective transparency as a basis for international cooperation, effective prevention of trade disputes, ongoing updating of trade rules, and direct servicing to private sector and civil society. And I think if you can imagine that, the good place to start is to look at what we are going to do this morning with this symposium, because the Tbt Committee has a lot of this feature present. And I think that the very high level attendance that we have today here and online provides recognition of the importance of these matters that we were just discussing with the ambassadors. In my view, the symposium comes at a very important juncture for three reasons. The first one is, of course, the economic crisis. You know that we are in difficult times. There are multiple shocks hitting the world, security shocks and related uncertainty, supply chain disruptions, and energy and food price shocks. Also, the looming prospect of balance of payments difficulties and financial crisis, inflationary growth. And as you know, we have been downgrading our forecast for world trade next year to only 1% of growth. And in face of those challenges, one thing that we can do is to ensure that our supply chains are effective and resilient and bring goods to where they are needed. The Tbt Agreement and the work of the Tbt Agreement is directly relevant to that endeavor. If you just take one example, during the COVID-19 crisis, we have been seeing a lot of discrepancies between standards, which created problems. Different standards hindered access to masks and personal protective equipments, and they have been delaying the approval and supply of vaccines. Then many countries have resorted to fast-tracking the processes for standard recognitions, showing how essential this issue was to fight the pandemic. And I should stress that the regulatory fast-tracking was not made at the expense of citizen health and well-being. To the contrary, it facilitated trade and helped really combat the disease. And if we take a longer historical perspective, the Tbt Committee has addressed more than 750 so-called trade concerns since 1995. By way of these deliberations, disputes have been prevented, and regulations are sometimes adapted before they go into force, adapted and improved thanks to the dialogue which has been happening in the institutions. Our latest analysis that our team will elaborate on later shows that the Tbt Committee discusses specific trade concerns that cover an estimated average of 2.4 trillion worth of import each year. So we are not talking about anecdotes here. It's really an issue of major importance. Second reason for this symposium being timely, I think that standards, play a major role in driving the double and structural transformation of our economy toward digitalization and decarbonization. If you take climate change, Tbt notifications represent 62% of all the environment-related notifications that the WTO receives from members. Out of those, 30% of all the WTO notification on climate change measures are being discussed in the Tbt Committee. Of course, not everything, fortunately, not need to discuss all the regulations, but 1/3 is already a significant proportion. Trade concerns related to climate change currently represent, on average, 25% of the measures which are being put on the committee agenda. This means very concrete things. This means that we are discussing questions which are at the core of the net zero transition, like the carbon footprint of solar panels or batteries for electric vehicles. It's also because we know that because of the lack of common standard for measuring carbon emission, there is a risk to both undermine environmental policies and create unnecessary barriers to trade. So we hear that the stakeholders in many heavy industry sectors like the iron and steels support a move toward more transparency and coherence on the standards, settings, and discussions. Take the digital economy, it's another area of utmost importance. And here members have engaged in discussions on issues such as cybersecurity and even artificial intelligence. All debates that we see developing in the real world about smart products, products which are permanently interconnected and constantly being fed with data via the internet so that they can learn and be ever improving. Well, here again, we have harmonized standards issue and regulation for interoperability and safety. That means that the Internet of Things is once again one other matter which is being discussed with an increasing importance in the Tbt Committee. These are just a few examples which give you a flavor of how the Tbt Committee is helping toward managing a smooth transition toward decarbonization and digitalization. And the third reason, I think, I hope the ambassador would be sensitive particularly to that one, is that that our members have decided to engage into deep discussion about WTO reform. Then I think, with a view to harvesting result at the next ministerial MC13, sorry. So maybe it's a good idea to start where things are working well, to see how they are, what are the lessons that we can learn and what we can emulate into other parts of the organization. I see three very appealing dimensions in the Tbt work. First one is on rulemaking. I put it with my body language between brackets, because the Tbt Committee develops soft rules, such as guidance and recommendations through an inclusive and transparent process. And for instance, the committee is working on important guidance regarding conformity assessment that is aiming at increasing trust in international trade. My point is that this type of work is an ongoing deliverable, which is an important complement to the hard rules that we have on the rule book of the WTO. It complements this work. Second, transparency. we have developed, we are very proud of it at the Secretariat, a powerful digital platform called EPing, which has attracted the attention of many members and the private sectors. It is a joint effort between Tbt and SPS committee, and also with the contribution of ITC and DESA. And I think it's an example of what we can do best, allowing our members to use a global system to follow regular and track regulatory changes around the world that may affect trade. And some of our key members, the United States, I believe, under your control, Ambassador, and the EU, I think we have the Deputy DG online, are transitioning their own national monitoring system toward the EPing system because they consider it as reliable, user-friendly, and modern. And importantly, also, the private sector is very engaged. Over 40% of the subscribers are from the private sector. Third element, capacity building. We have been very happy this week that we have been hosting at the WTO an innovative transparency champion program to deepen the knowledge and skills of government officials from Africa. The program is directed at officials who implement Tbt transparency disciplines on a daily basis. And I would like to welcome the first cohort of transparency champions, which I understand are in the room with us today. And so you can raise the hand so that we see how many. Oh yeah, that's a significant program. That's also congratulations. So this is the story behind the rather scary Tbt acronym. I must say that when I started my career, I was very afraid of Tbt. Now I'm in love with it. Making value chains more efficient, supporting the transition toward the future models of trade, and acting as a laboratory maybe for the reform of the WTO. Yet one question remains unsolved, so that we have a relevant symposium is, how much do we know? How much do we know about the benefits of this work? Can we try to measure those benefits both in terms of quality and quantity? And this is a question that we are going to start tackling today, looking at some figures. I think it's very important because regulation or divergent regulation would hinder our ability to address problems of the global commons. Well, all these topics are on the agenda. I have already been too long for the ambassadors, so I'll give back the floor to the moderators. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Marie, for really setting the scene for us. And let me also recognize Deputy Director General Maeve Rutte, who has joined us online. She's on your screen. She's the Deputy Director General of DG GROW of the European Union. So thank you very much for joining us, madam. And we'll move to our first speaker, who is Ambassador of Uruguay, Ambassador Chancellor Gomez. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Ike. Good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be participating in this event, which I find it very important and very timely, of course. Well, coming from Uruguay, I think you will indulge me if I start saying that for us, tariffs remains an important barrier to trade. In particular, if we talk about agriculture or agri-food products. And of course, for sure, a lot of work remains to be done in this house regarding that, but I'm not going to talk about that today. In fact, we all know that currently, the most important barriers often have to do with the more complex, less transparent, and the hard to navigate world of non-tariff measures, including standards and regulations. As we know, technical regulations, standards, and conformity assessments procedures are all dealt under the Wto Tbt Agreement. This agreement recognizes the role of governments to adopt and implement such measures in order to achieve legitimate public policy goals, such as protection of human health or environment, while at the same time providing the guardrails to prevent them from being used to shield domestic producers from foreign competitors or being unnecessarily trade restrictive. The agreement also creates the Tbt Committee, which has a broad mandate and serves as a platform for members to discuss any matters relating to the operation of the agreement or the furtherance of its objectives. And I want to focus on the role and importance of this committee in today's discussions. Needless to say, in order for the committee to fulfill its function, transparency is a must. Members must notify their draft regulations and conformity assessment well in advance and allow other members sufficient time to present comments that should be duly taken into account in the development of their final measures. But let me underline this. It's not only by notifying, but also by being willing to listen to others and truly consider their views, and of course act in consequence, that members engage in meaningfully regulatory cooperation. I think this is a very important point we have to keep in mind. WTO has made important progress in the last few years to enhance transparency with respect to regulatory development across the entire WTO membership, including by the presentation of the renewed EP platform that was mentioned before by Jean-Marie, which serves as a one-stop shop where members can present their notifications, receive alerts on those others, and engage other members and stakeholders. But this is not only important for governments. In fact, we cannot overemphasize the importance of this tool for enterprises. And let me say that in particular for SMEs. This is very important for these enterprises to stay abreast of the latest regulatory developments in the markets and products of their interest, and engage with their governments to take action if needed. Tbt Committee also fulfills an important role in easing trade tensions in the area of regulations and standards by serving as a forum where members review both draft and final measures that may affect their commercial interest through the presentation and discussions of the so-called specific trade concerns. And this is a very important function. As a former CTG chair, I can testify that. This multilateral exercise has proven to be of value for members in different ways. For example, it allows smaller delegations, like mine, for example, to become aware of and engage in discussions on measures that may be of their interest. Also importantly, it allows members to better understand each other and the intent of their measures, iron out and ease tensions before they may escalate into a formal trade dispute. And this is a very important function of this committee. As any person that has ever been to a Tbt committee meeting knows, great deal of time in each meeting is spent in the discussions of these STCs. This, in our view, it's a testimony of the relevance and value that members assign to this mechanism. But that's not the only thing that the Tbt Committee does. Life doesn't stop here for the Tbt Committee. Committee has undertaken 9 triennial reviews of the operation and implementation of the agreement. And as a result of it, it has developed a series of decisions and recommendations intended to facilitate the implementation of the agreement. On different issues such as transparency, international standards, conformity assessment. And this can be used by WTO membership as a whole to build convergence on regulatory matters. The committee have also conducted work on the field of good regulatory practices, and it is generally accepted that the application of the best regulatory practices and procedures can strengthen domestic coordination and help ensure the design of high quality, cost-effective regulations that are consistent with our goal of an open trade. In addition, work on the development of non-prescriptive practical guidance intended to support regulators in the choice and design of appropriate and proportionate conforming assessment procedures, as mandated in the 8th triennial review, is currently ongoing. Importantly, the Tbt Committee serves also as a forum for exchanging experiences and promoting international regulatory cooperation, which may help address current and emerging global challenges, being in the sphere of environment, health, or digitalization, that was also mentioned before. In this sense, it must be noted that the 9th triennial review resulted in recommendations to hold thematic sessions on best practices related to TBT compliant technical regulations and standards that support the attainment of the environmental goals and contribute to address climate change. B, plastic regulation and policy, with a view to promoting the application of regulatory approaches to minimize waste leakage and pollution while encouraging trade and innovation. C, the impact of technical barriers on trade in intangible digital products. You were talking about that. And how to reduce them. D, how to promote regulatory approaches to cybersecurity that maximize cybersecurity, trade and innovation outcomes while minimizing unnecessary barriers. And E, work with SMEs to ensure that they are aware and have access to the relevant information necessary to overcome obstacles and enhance their participation in international trade. This goes perfectly in line with the recommendation endorsed by the informal working group on SMEs in 2020 on promoting SMEs inclusion in regulatory development in the areas of trade and the development of tools such as the Global Trade Help Desk and the Trade for SMEs platform, which are a magnificent complement to the e-ping we were discussing before. So to summarize, I want to say that the Tbt Committee, as well as other regulated bodies of WTO, plays an important, even though not always recognized, role in overseeing the application of the WTO agreement, as well as in promoting multilateral cooperation and the prevention of regulatory bottlenecks, which of course may ease trade tensions and help supply chains be more effective and also more resilient. Therefore, we welcome the initiative to hold this symposium. I hope that you will find it as interesting, timely, useful as we do. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Excellency. I think thank you again for bringing into perspective the MISME dimension, which is really important, and actually pointing very concretely to how TBT helps. You know, I know, of course. And I think you really shed a lot of light on what Jean-Marie mentioned as ongoing deliverable. What does that actually mean? And so it was, thank you so much for that. And let me pass on the floor to Ambassador Maria Pagan, Ambassador of the United States. Thank you.
Well, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to be here, engaged on this important topic, reflecting on some of the words that the DDG said. Technical barriers to trade and some of the terminology associated with it are really unsexy, boring, but very important. And all the topics that have been raised and will be raised here are very important and very topical. As I'm sure most of you know, the United States is a very active participant in the Tbt Committee. And here I do want to echo what the DDG said. We do consider the Tbt Committee to be an exemplary committee and one of the best, if not the best, functioning committee in the WTO. And we are indeed looking at why that is and what has happened in that, the energy that that committee has as we look at, how that type of work can be transported and moved into other committees, because we do consider it to be, to work really well. From October 2021 to September 2022, the United States and its stakeholders have provided 227 comments to the almost 4,000 notifications made by WTO members to the committee. And as has been noted, the opportunity to engage early with other members on proposed technical regulations and conformity assessment procedures is crucial in maximizing the chances that good suggestions will be taken into account and can be taken into account before measures are finalized. And that is very critical. We are indeed excited about the new updates to the e-ping alert system. As frequent users, we rely on it to convey notifications of proposed technical regulations and conformity assessment procedures. Here we go, the very boring terms, to interested stakeholders, including the US government. So we indeed are very happy with that development. As you know, the TBT agreement seeks to ensure that technical regulations and conformity assessment procedures do not create unnecessary obstacles to trade, recognizing that many measures may in fact be necessary to ensure the quality of products, to protect human, animal, or plant life or health, to protect the environment, or to prevent deceptive practices. So how do we resolve concerns about measures that may arise, particularly out of differences in regulatory approaches? And this is where the work, some of the work that is done in the committee is crucial. First, of course, we try to resolve the issue at the technical level, either through the exchange of information between our designated points of communication, the WTO TBT inquiry points, or through exchanges between the notifier and our in-country embassy staff. But we also do discuss issues bilaterally here at the WTO. And while these exchanges are similar to conversations the embassy may be having in capital, the benefit is bringing Geneva staff in to broaden the knowledge of in-country representatives' understanding of the TBT agreement. If those communications are not successful, and we believe other members may have similar concerns to ours, we may raise the issue on the floor at the TBT committee. And this allows other members to better understand the level or magnitude of concern and share the concerns among the members. And I will point that, and this is perhaps one of the reasons why this committee is so good, that is very helpful that in those conversations we are involving our regulatory experts. The United States uses a variety of tools to address regulatory divergences. We cooperate on standards, for example, in international organizations such as the Codex Alimentarius or the United Nations Economic Committee for Europe Working Party 29. We do mutual recognition arrangements, like the International Laboratory Accreditation Corporation or bilateral mutual recognition agreements. For example, in the case of certain medicines, we have negotiated MRAs with select foreign counterparts to allow our regulators and the regulators in our partner countries to mutually recognize our respective inspection documents for pharmaceutical manufacturing facilities, where our regulators are confident that the facilities produce safe and effective medicines. By reducing duplicative efforts among trusted regulatory authorities, the United States is streamlining the movement of pharmaceutical goods and creating a stronger, more reliable supply chain that minimizes drug shortages. Another thing that we have done is that we have included sectoral agreements in some of our free trade agreements, and the latest example being the sectoral agreements on medical devices and pharmaceuticals in our US-Mexico-Canada agreement. Are you okay? So how do the activities of the WTO TBT Committee assist members to reduce trade frictions? The United States sees great benefit in thematic discussions held informally on the margins of the TBT Committee, such as this. Whether it's describing regulatory cooperation in the medical devices sector, engaging with a partner like Brazil to organize the annual thematic discussion on good regulatory practices, or partnering with Canada to assemble an upcoming day-long dialogue on plastics regulation and climate change. These discussions and their emphasis on finding commonality and transparency in our regulatory systems are useful in providing early and thoughtful discussion on members' practices and experiences. These discussions help us to better expand upon our ability to assist manufacturers, farmers, and ranchers to provide their products to other markets. The current focus on understanding other members' efforts to regulate to protect the environment is of particular interest to the Biden administration, and we look forward to the upcoming dialogue in the committee in 2023. We, for example, have used the TBT committee to effectively communicate with trading partners during the pandemic. For example, we notified a conformity assessment procedure on particulate filtering respirator masks by our CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, to ensure all our trading partners were fully informed. So what more can WTO members do to counter disruptions in the supply chain that are linked to standards-related measures? Clear, consistent, and early communication on upcoming measures and taking comments of interested stakeholders into account is the best way to reduce technical barriers to trade. So transparency and the notice and comment and the back and forth is crucial. We also believe that consistent and substantive contributions to the development and use of international standards also contributes to the reduction of technical barriers to trade. The United States is actively working on fortifying our efforts to engage on international standards and collaborate with trading partners on critical and emerging technologies. Some of these have been mentioned before: artificial intelligence, automated driving systems, biotechnology, quantum computing, and information and communication technologies. For example, the US Federal Drug Administration is engaged in a rulemaking on incorporating the ISO 13485 international standard into its medical device regulations. Again, let's come up with sexier titles for things. We also work closely with the US National Standards Body and US signatory to the Tbt Agreement Code of Good Practice, the American National Standards Institute, or ANSI. ANSI holds and participates in regional meetings of the Americas and Asia Pacific and has a bilateral dialogue with other national standards bodies. For example, the Standards Administration of China, DIN in Germany, and CATS in Korea. One point to make is that countries must take care not to regulate emerging technologies prematurely, since this could stifle technological innovation. We urge countries to look to international standards in these areas, and where none exist, to work together in international fora to develop appropriate standards based on scientific evidence, transparency, and consensus. A great example of this is electric vehicles. In 2020, key global stakeholders came together under the auspices of UNESE WP29 to adopt a global technical regulation for electric vehicle safety. Known as the UN Global Technical Regulation number 20, it addresses major concerns associated with the safety performance of electric vehicles during normal operations and sets a high standard for driver and occupant protection. The United States also uses a variety of opportunities to provide technical assistance, such as USAID, Standards Alliance, COVID-19 Medical Device Regulatory Convergence Project, which is conveying assistance to 10 partner countries across Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia to increase the transparency and predictability of regulatory systems for medical devices by providing technical assistance and good regulatory practices. The Standards Alliance has also focused programs on Africa. For example, we supported Mozambique in the finalization of its national quality policy. This included providing a series of technical trainings with public and private sector stakeholders from Mozambique to build awareness for the benefits of a well-developed quality system based on the principles of the Tbt Agreement. To assist in the implementation of this policy, we also developed a national quality infrastructure handbook with Mozambique's national standards body to assist in the understanding and implementation of the Tbt Agreement. I'd like to end by underscoring that we see great value in thematics discussion in the Wto Tbt Committee, such as those today, on cooperative efforts in medical, automotive, and information technologies, which are critically important to global trade. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and looking forward to listening to the other speakers.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And it is true, we do have a branding problem, TBT, Technical Barriers to Trade. We've tried many ways to make ourselves more sexy, and this symposium is part of the effort. But I think Ambassador Tan Hung Seng of Singapore will be able to help us with this branding issue. And so we look forward to hearing from you, Ambassador. Thank you.
Thank you. Very good morning to all, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this timely symposium on easing regulatory bottlenecks. And it's great to see such good participation from Africa. Jean-Marie, don't worry, I'm not going to say anything that will make you choke.
Thank you for the drug.
It's from your colleague. Let me start by setting what we are going to discuss this morning in a broader context. Last week, we heard some good news and some bad news from the WTO Secretariat. The good news is that WTO economies have revised upwards their forecast of global merchandise trade from 0.1% to 3.5% in 2022. However, the bad news is that the growth forecast for next year, 2023, has been reduced sharply from 3.4% to only 1%. These figures are not surprising, as WTO members continue to face domestic and global uncertainties and challenges. As we continue to confront growing inflation spurred on by escalating food and fuel prices, supply chain disruptions, climate change, natural disasters, and geostrategic tensions. So against such a backdrop, it has become even more important that we, WTO members, should be doing our best to ease regulatory bottlenecks, including reducing technical barriers to trade, or TBT. Unfortunately, this does not appear to be the case. In fact, the Secretariat reported that as of 31st August this year, members have submitted close to 50,000 notifications of TBT measures since 1995. Some other research has also estimated that more than 90% of global goods exports are affected by TBT measures. These numbers reflect the complexity surrounding TBTs, as Ekho had highlighted. On one hand, TBT measures can be important policy tools to achieve legitimate policy objectives, such as protecting consumer health, to guard against deceptive practices, or even to prevent environmental damages. On the other hand, TBT measures can be misused to restrict trade when they are discriminatory or impose unnecessary regulatory obstacles. Hence, the key, as we have heard, is to ensure that TBT measures are implemented in the least trade restrictive manner possible. Allow me to make 3 suggestions here. First, we should rely on widely accepted international standards as far as possible, as this would facilitate the harmonization of members' standards and regulations. In Singapore, for example, the government encourages the adoption of international standards whenever possible. We turn to our own standards and technical references only when international standards do not exist, or where there is a need to customize standards to meet unique domestic requirements. At the end of December 2020, Singapore had a total of 821 standards, of which more than half were based on international standards. We recognized that regulatory divergences increased regulatory compliance costs for businesses and can significantly impact exports. And this is particularly acute for developing members and MSMEs, which often lack the capacity to customize their products to the different technical specifications required by different jurisdictions. Hence, members should consider adopting a similar approach, particularly in relation to addressing emerging global challenges such as sustainability and digital trade. Second, stakeholder engagement during the development of standards and regulations should be part and parcel of the design process. It is vital for governments to work closely with the private sector to co-create technical regulations and standards. This is particularly important for the emerging digital economy, given the rapid pace of technological advancements. By working closely with industry stakeholders, governments can better feel the pulse and respond in a more timely and targeted manner. And this is a point that Maria had also raised. In this regard, we commend the Tbt Committee's initiative to organize regular thematic sessions dealing with transparency. Another laudable initiative, as highlighted by Jean-Marie, is the Secretariat's e-ping system, which allows governments and the public to provide comments on notified measures through the system. Third, members should continuously review our TBT measures even after adoption to ensure that they are fit for purpose. The discussions on specific trade concerns, or STCs, by the Tbt Committee is a good example. It provides a platform for members to share experiences as well as encourage dialogue among members to address regulatory concerns and bottlenecks. According to the Secretariat, members have raised over 700 STCs between 1995 and 2022. Tellingly, only 57 disputes involving TBT have been initiated. This demonstrates the value of the Tbt Committee as a platform for members to engage meaningfully to ease regulatory bottlenecks. Having said that, it is noteworthy that a significant portion of the STCs reviewed are recurring concerns, some of which have been raised over 20 to 30 times. Hence, it is useful for the Tbt Committee to look into improving its deliberation of STCs by building on past discussions to develop a set of best practices on raising and responding to STCs in a transparent manner. Let me end by saying that although well-designed TBT measures are an essential part of every member's policy toolkit, it is the responsibility of every WTO member to ensure that we use the right tools to address the right problems at the right time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ambassador Tan, and thanks for also drawing attention to international standards, and that's really one of the big raison d'etre of the TBT committee, this alignment to international standards. So that was really very helpful. And just to announce, because many of you have mentioned ePing, for those who don't know, ePing has actually launched a mobile app, so it's now available on smartphones as well. I think it's the first WTO app of its type, and so I'm really proud of the team who's working on it. I just want to recognize the colleague Sarah Irel, who's sitting at the back of the room here, for leading a lot of the work on this. So thank you, Sarah. I'd like to turn now to DDG Maeve Rutte, who's online, if you're ready, from DG Grow of the European Union. So DDG Rutte, would you like to take the floor?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. And very pleased to be today part of such a distinguished panel to open this very timely event. And let me also from my side then share some points which are, I think, very much aligned to the various statements already done by the ambassadors. So, of course, we already see that the title of this symposium itself already clearly sets out the challenges that we need to address. We are indeed living in difficult times. We have just come out of the pandemic. The pandemic is not even fully over yet. We, of course, also very much see the impacts of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. We see the energy crisis in Europe and more broadly. We, of course, also still go through the climate crisis, and all of this puts our resistance and our resilience to a test. So regulating on this backdrop is really a strategic and a legitimate instrument of governments to keep people safe and healthy, while preserving also the environment, promoting sustainability, and of course keeping our economies competitive. However, we all experience how divergent legislative systems lead to unnecessary burdens to global trade. These barriers hamper economic growth and affect the most vulnerable. SMEs, for example, are particularly hit by unnecessary administrative burden, which add costs to their already let's say, tried out resources. So with a view to reduce these burdens, the European Union is working on an SME relief package that will ensure the right enabling business environment. And more generally, the European Union is committed to better regulation, including when it comes to design conformity assessment procedures, where we aim to implement the least burdensome ones to the benefit of all stakeholders. But of course, we cannot act alone. Improving international cooperation to address current and emerging global challenges in the regulatory sphere is necessary, and the WTO represents, of course, a key forum for engaging with trading partners. While improvements have been achieved by members when addressing specific trade concerns, we still have to make further progress. A concrete way to build convergence on regulatory matters is, of course, developing multilateral guidance and recommendations. The adoption of the guidelines on conformity assessment procedures is, I think, a good example. Their purpose, as we all know, is to minimize burden from testing and certification procedure by making them proportionate to the risks. This will be beneficial for all members and in particular, of course, for the small and medium-sized businesses in these countries. Enhancing transparency is also a key element. By facilitating tracking of measures, transparency allows users to notify and follow changes in product requirements. And I would like to join the choir, really praising our WTO Secretariat for the new e-ping platform. We also find it a very useful tool. So thanks a lot for that. Now, let me also share really some short ideas or views on the standardization, which has been already raised by the other speakers. And of course, we all realize that what would the technological development be if we would not use our gadgets, be it mobile phones, be it our bank cards, when we go abroad. So it's really essential that we have standards which apply across borders, which make our life safe and convenient when we talk about Wi-Fi access or other many of these common shared benefits we nowadays have from technology. We have got so used to these benefits that we often take them for granted. And I would like to underline this today, particularly in this forum, that of course, these benefits come from internationally agreed standards. And we need to indeed make sure that we keep collaborating on creating such internationally accepted, recognized, appreciated standards. This is, of course, also why we very much use the opportunities for structured dialogue with several WTO members, be it the US, China, Japan, and others. And of course, we will also continue working very much through our European standardization organizations. You know them, Senelec, ETSI. And these are, of course, the ones which have collaboration agreements with cooperation agreements with many organizations around the world. And we have also recently in Europe adopted a new standardization strategy, which aims at really making sure that we have a stronger capacity to focus on these standards, which are particularly necessary for green and digital transition, and where we also then make sure that we have proper skills available and resources for standard setting processes. And let me also then touch upon the main point perhaps today about the supply chains. The EU places really a great importance on resilience of the supply chains. And we see that openness to trade and international cooperation really are essential parts of the efforts to address supply chain vulnerabilities. In the European Union, our single market is, of course, really a central piece in functioning of the supply chains and the access to services and goods, especially in times of difficulties. So for this reason, we have proposed a new single market emergency instrument that will support a strong and open single market in times of crisis, and which foresees, among other measures, the possibility to accelerate the procedure for placing products on the market in case of supply shortages. And more generally, the European Union has undertaken in-depth analysis of our dependencies in relation to both strategic products and technologies. Looking to the future, we will need to better anticipate future risks and possible shortages of materials or technologies, and really need to be ready to provide properly and on time for the digital and green transition. And we also, of course, say that to achieve it, this is not something that Europe will do alone. We will need to work together, engage globally, if we want to achieve such sustainable and durable solutions. And I hope that the discussions today are going to help us really illuminate the path towards this digital and low carbon future. And I wish all of us a good debate today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Director General Wto. I think this brings us to the close of the statements from the panel. And if you allow me, I'll just try to conclude, and then before we move on to the next session, the next panel session. And I think what we heard was really a wide range of perspectives. But a key one to me is that we have something here in the TBT committee that you, the members, find beneficial and that you see it as working. And then another key one is that how do we learn from what is happening in the TBT committee? What were the ingredients that allowed this to work? And is this possible to be, let's say, disseminated more widely across the WTO? But in learning what works in the WTO, we also have to recognize, in the TBT, I should say, have to recognize some things could work better. And there are also challenges that the TBT committee faces. Transparency is a great achievement, lots of notifications, but the numbers of notifications have also got to be backed up with people actually using these notifications in a meaningful way. And I think that's part of the work that my colleagues in the Transparency Champions have already launched, work that yourselves in the committee are doing all the time, to understand, what do we do with the notification, put it very basically, and how does that help us to deepen engagement and therefore to ease regulatory bottlenecks? So that would be another key area of work, I think. STCs, many have mentioned the large number of STCs, the very useful process, and in fact, some of the facts showing that STCs reduce the number of disputes. But at the same time, and Ambassador Tan, you said very correctly that some STCs recur all the time on the agenda. And, from each meeting to each meeting, the same STC. So I think there's some need to also understand what is going on in this sort of situation and what more could be done to help. And in that sense, I think some of the panelists also talked about engagement, and I think that is probably the key thing with the TBT committee is the ability to create the conditions that allow for engagement, an engagement between regulators, engagement between capitals, and at the same time providing the tools for such engagement and to have a possibility to deepen the engagement over a series of meetings and not just a one-off situation. So I think that was also very an important thing. And I liked very much the term ongoing deliverable, not just because Jean-Marie said it, because it's a very nice term. and that maybe is a sort of branding issue we need to try to think about. Because, in this house, we tend to think of deliverables as the one thing we do before a ministerial conference and the agreement is done, signed, delivered. And we don't look so much into things that we do every day, all the time, which are also delivering. Recognizing, of course, it's challenging to get that type of attention on certain types of work in the house, but I think it also deserves a little bit of attention. It's a bit like looking underneath the hood of the car, if you like, the engine. We all assume the engine will work and the engine will keep going. But from time to time, it's good to lift the hood and have a look at it and sort of see whether it can be improved and why is it helping us to get to where we want to go. So those were just a few points. And thank you all again for this great session. I hope you'll be able to join us again in the future. We do hope to try to do these types of symposiums on a more regular basis. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And a hand of applause for the panel. Thank you. And please stay on. Those of you online, I'm told there are over 200 participants online. Please don't go away. Sarah will be moderating the next panel. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm taking over from our director, Ho Lim, to moderate the second segment of this symposium, titled Magnitude of Regulatory Bottlenecks. I'm told that we should wrap up actually this session by 11:45, so we have to go with a good tempo, as we also have a third round of very interesting panelists coming up. So just before we heard from our senior officials, ambassadors, that about the importance of the Tbt Agreement, the Tbt Committee, how it helps with regulatory cooperation, avoiding unnecessary costs, and how it can facilitate trade while recognizing need for governments to protect their populations and the environment. Of course, not everything is resolved, but it really helps in this process, as we heard. But can we quantify some of the benefits of this work? Can we put some facts and figures out there? We also heard earlier on that this topic is not a very sexy one. And I think those of us in this room and probably virtually joining are kind of agreeing with the premise that the work here is of great benefit, but if we want to transmit this message to a broader public, it would help to have some numbers maybe, and some simpler messages, because this could also further strengthen the engagement internationally and domestically on the work of this committee. And I was very happy to hear that the DG program has finally fallen in love with the Tbt Agreement, and maybe money can buy some more love from the broader public. And hence, this is why we have this panel here. I'm joined by 4 panelists. We have a guest from Brussels, Mr. Lucian Cernat. He's the head of Global Regulatory Cooperation, TBT and International Public Procurement at DG Trade at the European Commission. We also have Mr. Anwar Hussain Sheikh. He's a counselor with the Indian delegation to the WTO, but he's currently also the chair of the Tbt Committee. And I also have with me 2 colleagues from the Trade and Environment Division, Devin McDaniels and Rainer Lanz, and who will present the findings from a recent study they've done. So the way we will proceed is that I will first give the floor to Devin and Rainer to share with us findings from their study, attempting to quantify a bit the value of trade that is covered in committee discussions through STCs. Then we'll turn to Lucian to hear about another study they've done looking at the issue from the angle of the EU. And then we will turn to Anwar to have some, as a discussant, to share some reactions before we open the floor. So now I think I will turn to my colleagues, Devin and Rainer, to start. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be here. Good morning to everyone. So Rainer and I will share this presentation, and we would like to share with you some work in progress that we've been doing, trying to basically, as Sarah was saying, to quantify the value of trade that is covered by the specific trade concerns discussion in the Tbt Committee. And I should say that this is a work in progress, a research working paper that we've been developing, Rainer and I, together with Eric Wikström and Matteo Ferrero, who are also sitting here with us, our colleagues. So the objective of this project that we launched on was to really improve our overall understanding of what is the sort of trade that's at stake when we're talking about the TBT specific trade concerns. We know the number of STCs are rising each year, and there are many, especially previously raised STCs that are discussed, but we didn't have a good sense of the economic and commercial importance of these trade concerns. So what we did is that we took the products that are subject to STCs and essentially matched them with trade data. So we used the HS codes that are available through the WTO Trade Concerns database, which is also part of the EPING system. And we match those with the imports of members that are responding to STCs. And we did this to then come up with a value of trade that is covered by STCs, which could potentially be eased by cooperation and discussion in the TBT committee. So maybe at the outset, it's important to mention a couple of caveats. So first of all, we aren't making any judgment on whether STCs themselves or the measures underlying STCs themselves are trade barriers. Rather, we're just talking about the value of imports that are subject to these measures that are discussed in the committee. Moreover, we are not making any assumptions about the resolution of STCs, or therefore whether there's a certain amount of trade that has been facilitated through that resolution process. So it's really an exercise to quantify the value of trade that's covered.
So let me continue with explaining some of the charts, the findings. So we start with how much trade is covered by new STCs raised in the TBT committee. And here on this chart, you see the gray bars represent the number of new STCs that were raised and for which we have information on the product HS code. And if you look at the numbers, so between 2022 and 2020, 560 new STCs were raised for which you have HS codes. And also there was a high of new STCs raised in 2020 with around 51 STCs. A second indicator in this chart is the so-called coverage ratio, which is the share of imports covered by STCs in global imports. So basically, it helps us understand the share of global trade that is potentially affected by measures subject to STCs. And the coverage ratio is indicated by the blue points and on the right axis in the chart. So if you look at the coverage ratio, we see that there's a high in 2020 where basically 14% of global merchandise imports were covered by new STCs. And there was a low in 2019 with 1.3% of imports covered by STCs. If we look at the entire period 22 to 2020, around 5% of global merchandise imports were covered by new STCs over that period. However, trade is not only affected by new STCs, but also potentially affected by STCs that have been raised in previous years and that keep on going. So here you can see the yellow part of the bars are basically we add the number of previously raised STCs. So for instance, if you look at the year 2012, we had 33 new STCs raised in that year and more than 50 STCs that were raised in 2012, but which had already been raised in previous years. And if you look at the number of previous STCs, we see that the number of previous STCs is larger than the number of new STCs and becomes larger over time, which reflects the fact that members often raise the same STC multiple times over the years. So now let's look at the coverage ratio of new and previously raised STCs together. And here we see that there's a high in 2011 where 24%, so almost a quarter of global merchandise imports were subject to measures raised in STCs. And if you look at the entire period, new and previously raised STCs covered on average 17% of global merchandise imports during 2022 and 2020. Which members are most frequently responding to STCs? Here in this chart, you see the members sorted by the number of STCs where the members is a respondent, and we only look at new STCs raised in the committee over the period. And we see that 3 members, the European Union, China, and the United States, are those members against whom STCs are raised most often. So in the case of the EU, it's 79 STCs, for China, it's 66 STCs, and from the United States, 44 STCs. The chart also shows the average import value covered by STCs. And over the period, you see that the average STC raised against the European Union covered $109 billion compared to an average STC covered imports of 54 billion for China and 27 billion for the United States. So it's not surprising, given the respective market sizes, that it's these 3 countries that are the top 3 countries in terms of average value per STCs. And if you look at these countries together, so they drive the overall trends in the imports covered by STCs. They account for around 90% of annual imports covered by new STCs since 2002. However, this should not overshadow the fact that STCs involve many members, both on the responding and raising side. And while a number of STCs might only cover a small value of trade at a global level, the trade covered can still be important in relative terms, either at the country or at the sector level. In this slide, we look at which products covered by STCs are most significant in value terms. Here, this is sorted by the average value per STC. And you see that for mineral fuels, you have like 4 STCs which cover, each STC covers close to $140 billion. So it has the highest average value. Average values per STCs are also high for electrical machinery and pharmaceutical products. For each of these product groups, the average STC is more than $50 billion. Now let's add the dimension of the number of STCs raised in these products. And you can see that in the sectors electrical machinery and machinery, they don't only have a high average import value per STC, but also a high number of STCs. So it is in these 2 sectors where new STCs cover the most significant overall value of imports over the period. So for instance, 75 STCs related to electrical machinery covered more than 4 trillion of imports, while 71 STCs related to machinery covered around 3.6 trillion of imports over the 20-year periods we're looking at. And if taken together, the STCs relating to electrical machinery and machinery, they account for around 10% of the number of STCs, but for around 52% of the aggregate import value of new STCs raised in the Tbt Committee.
So if we look overall at some of the preliminary findings from this work, so we found that on average, an STC, when it's raised for the first time in the Tbt Committee, covers 29 billion worth of imports. So these are significant figures. And if we look overall between 2002 and 2020, new STCs on an annual basis covered around $786 billion worth of imports per year, representing around 5.4% of global imports. And then if we look at new and previously raised together over this period, the value covered is on average $2.4 trillion per year, again, representing around 16.7% of global imports. So again, these figures, I think are an indication of that there is indeed quite a significant value of trade that's discussed in this Tbt Committee through specific trade concerns, and which could potentially be hindered by regulatory bottlenecks, and indeed for which further cooperation and discussion in the committee could help us to facilitate solutions. So again, to say this is a work in progress. We of course very much welcome your feedback and comments, and we'll be sharing this and this draft working paper soon for comment. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rainer and Devin, for this path-breaking study. In fact, I don't think, at least from the Secretariat side, we've ever dug into the figures like this. And this is the benefit of marrying different skills. We have had the opportunity to draw on support from economist colleague, Rainer, who could connect his knowledge with Devin's extensive knowledge on the STCs. So I think I will now turn to Lucian to share with us the findings of a study they've done, this time from the perspective of the EU. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Hello, everyone, and thank you for taking precious time to follow what I think it's an extremely important topic in the current global trading context, addressing regulatory barriers. We heard in the previous panel the type of issues that we are regularly facing and companies are regularly facing when trading across borders. So what I would try to illustrate with some evidence is that the deliberations in the Wto Tbt Committee is not just cheap talk. Is not talk about trade. In fact, very valuable cooperation, very valuable regulatory cooperation between like-minded WTO members who together putting together their expertise, sharing best practices. Eventually, over time, they managed to reduce what we call in the unsexy jargon specific trade concerns. Maybe some of the specific trade concerns are actually serious trade concerns. And once, every now and in a while, when we try to facilitate or to eliminate the reasons for such serious trade concerns, once we together achieve that, the numbers that we have prepared from a European perspective, I think, are quite impressive. Let me from the outset, put a little disclaimer on my presentation today. The findings and the arguments that I will present to you are personal comments. They do not necessarily reflect the official position of the European Commission. Is based on a research paper that I have produced with one of our colleagues. And what made this work possible is also the fact that, as Sarah said, you need to blend together different types of analytical perspectives. As a former chief trade economist, I had a love for numbers. Now I have a love for TBT. So when you put the two together, you start to see some interesting findings. So one starting point, which I think is relevant not just for the European Union, but for many other WTO members, is to put in perspective the sheer importance and the prevalence of the technical barriers to trade as witnessed by companies. So these, it's a summary of a pan-European survey that we conducted, a business survey, a representative survey on a very large sample with both large and small and medium enterprises. And we asked them what kind of barriers they face abroad when they try to export. And the distribution of the problems they face is what you see here. So you can easily notice that technical requirements and conformity assessment stand out as the most important barrier faced by companies in pretty much across all sectors. Now, I would also like to emphasize, like other speakers, that the fact that we have some regulations in place does not necessarily mean that these are barriers. There are probably non-tariff measures for very good reasons, and trying to separate the chaff from the grain, trying to see what is really an unjustified, costly and unnecessary barrier is very difficult. And that's why I think the work of the committee is so crucially important, because it allows that conversation to be very, very specific and address real issues. So while not being always able to modify the perspective of particular trading partners. We have a discussion. Sometimes we remain at that discussion level, but sometimes we manage to remove some barriers. And in this work, we only looked at those specific trade concerns that, in our perspective, have led to a successful result, partial or fully satisfactory. Also here, if you manage to remove such barriers, the existing literature indicates that the cost equivalent, the tariff equivalent you want, the savings that companies, exporters and importers, because these are costs shared by the two parties of an international trade transaction, they are oftentimes much higher than the usual tariffs that they also face sometimes. So it could be double-digit savings. Now, I think the work we did is fairly complementary with the work you've seen, or also from the WTO Secretariat, in the sense that we do believe that specific trade concerns take time to be solved. We have here a typical life cycle of a specific trade concern. You raise it for the first time. If it persists and if you think it's serious, you will raise it again. You may raise it many times. And with a bit of luck and with a lot of cooperation from the other WTO members, you might resolve this measure partially or fully after a number of years. The moment that specific trade concern has been resolved, it will positively affect trade, not in the next year, but for the years to follow. So that's why it's important to have this cumulative benefits effect of past specific trade concerns that were resolved in the past. They continue to deliver even today. So that's the logic that we applied in our methodology. Now, very quickly, for those of you who are methodologically inclined, I don't want to bore you too much with this, but I think it's important to understand what we did. Out of all the specific trade concerns that the European Union has raised over the last decade or so, we have considered 69 of them to be successful, partially or fully successful. We then moved to the next step, similarly to what WTO Secretariat colleagues did, and we tried to match the nature of these specific trade concerns with the HS codes, with the product codes that we usually use in trade transactions, the way we have trade statistics, in order to capture these gains. And for that, we had to really use a very multi-pronged approach. We had to rely on a case-by-case, very detailed reading of the actual text of the regulation, trying to understand that the metric is not an exact science. I think that's the caveat I should have said from the very beginning. This is not an exact science, but we tried our best to at least avoid any overestimation. So with that methodology, which is described in greater detail in the background paper that you will see at the end, we have managed to match over 900 HS codes to these successful trade concerns. Now, not all 69 of them were easy for us to match. So for some of them, it was virtually impossible for us to find a reasonable range of products. So we dropped them from the list. We prefer to drop these success stories from the list in order to avoid overestimation. We also made sure that if a product has been affected in a particular country by more than one STC, we did not count that product twice. So that should give you some reassurances that we tried our best to at least not overestimate the potential, the positive elements of what the Tbt committee did on a number of STCs. So I think here's the main takeaway that I'd like to spend a couple of moments on. When you look at the trade that was facilitated by these successful trade STCs, the ones we resolved, again, the assumption is that you would not raise a specific trade concern if it wasn't somewhat serious, right? At least in our case, we would raise specific trade concerns when we have some indication that companies have reasons to worry about an upcoming legislation in a particular country, when we detect certain clear potential problems ahead. So if you look at the type of sectors and products that benefited from the success stories, and I also like to mention from the outset, this is a picture of the EU trade benefits. But if you think about a specific trade concern that was probably raised by the EU alone or with another WTO member, most likely that trade concern was not exclusively relevant for the EU exporters. So there is an MFN angle to any success stories, and I would like to very much stress it here in my description, although we don't have the numbers to prove it, but I think it's one of the underlying logic of, and the reason why the committee has probably worked so well, because at the end of the day, we're talking about probably plurilateral or MFN benefits every time we solve an STC. It's not necessarily only a bilateral issue. And here we see medical devices, automotive, food products, electrical appliances. We heard that electrical appliances are subject to many STCs. You can see the type of products that have the trade that has been facilitated by sectors over the last decade or so. So we're talking about over 80 billion worth of EU exports. Now, if you ask yourself, how big is 80 billion for the European Union, being the largest trading bloc, I think still in the WTO, you may think, well, maybe 80 billion is not that much. It sounds like a big figure. I guarantee you that it's a big figure by any metric, but even in the great scheme of things, it represents roughly 4%, 4-5% of our total exports, merchandise exports. So it's by no means a negligible successful story. I also wanted to briefly spend maybe 1 minute on the destinations where these successful STCs were first identified and then successfully removed. The way in which some countries appear as large or small, of course, depends on 3 factors. It depends on the number of specific trade concerns that we have addressed vis-a-vis that WTO member. So the number of STCs matter. The number of successful STCs matter. And then the number of HS codes affected by those successful STCs matter as well. So these are the 3 parameters that indicate the value at the end of the day, the cumulative value vis-a-vis a bilateral trade relation, and also the size of the country. So China, for instance, being such a large market, of course, every time you solve a specific trade concern, and given that for many European companies, China is nowadays the largest destination market, it makes a difference. But again, as I said, I don't want to go into the details why some of these numbers are bigger than others. I think what is important, though, it's important that none of these would be possible without the cooperation of the WTO members concerned. So I think this is a picture of the extent to which the WTO Tbt Committee leads to positive outcome. And for that, it takes sometimes 2 to tango. So I think that's also the underlying message of this chart. Now, let me conclude with some key messages on looking at the work we tried to do. I think really the importance of the work that the Tbt Committee does is often overlooked. I think it's an understatement. It's almost completely overlooked, I would say. Why is that so? I mean, people say it is important, but it is so simply because we don't have the numbers to prove it. It's very difficult to prove, particularly in a technical field with technical jargons, that something is important. It's not enough to say it. You have to demonstrate it. So I think I would like to commend also the excellent work that the WTO Secretariat has done in this area, and all the efforts to collect information for greater transparency. I already mentioned that none of this would have been possible without the cooperation of the other WTO members. So I think that's the spirit that we would like to prevail in future discussions when it comes to specific trade concerns. And I also mentioned before that these are not bilateral gains. We shouldn't necessarily look at this from a zero-sum gain or a bilateral trade balance. Very often, specific trade concerns are raised by multiple members, and whenever there is progress on one of them, it benefits more than one country. We only manage to put together the numbers for the EU exports, also because it's extremely difficult. And I think that's a message I'd like to come back to it. We have to make an effort to make such work more easily by making this HS code matching something of a primary concern every time you notify if possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucian. That was very clear message. And I think I just maybe can highlight 3 points. Although you said it was not an exact science, I think the numbers are quite telling, even if they may not be perfectly correct about the magnitude we're talking about for all parties involved. I think it was very interesting how you highlighted the benefit from the resolution of SDCs or the pursuit of SDCs to the broader membership, not only to the two concerned. And despite all this, that this topic is overlooked, and maybe we have to think about, continue to think about ways to transmit a message about the value of the work, building on the such studies that you have been undertaking. Now I'd like to turn to Anwar. You are the chair of the Tbt Committee. And before working on trade and WTO matters, I understand you have also had quite some experience working on finance and investment matters for the government of India. And considering your multifaceted experience, what are your thoughts on what we have just heard? Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Before I comment, I'll just take a moment and reflect on what just Lucian said at the end, that the work done by Tbt Committee perhaps was not recognized, is not recognized, is very equivalent to a wicketkeeper in a cricket match. I guess some of you who follow cricket know cricket. There is a player called wicketkeeper who is right at the back. It's almost like the linchpin or the backbone of the team. When the wicketkeeper performs, or when the wicketkeeper keeps performing, nobody notices. Only when the wicketkeeper makes a extreme mistake, then he comes into focus. Till the time, nobody knows that such a good performance is being done by one of the team members. Similarly, Tbt Committee has been doing an excellent work, and in the last 3 months that I had the privilege of working with the Secretariat, I have really been impressed with their work. Besides Tbt work not being sexy, it is vast and it is complex, and adding problems are also those issues which oftentimes come up as STCs for lack of clarity, not necessarily for the reasons of regulatory bottlenecks. Then you also have issues of lack of information. Many delegates in the morning session talked about how important the transparency is in that sense. However, the effort to quantify cannot be understated, or we cannot emphasize how important it is. Both the presentations that we saw so far, I thought, were the beginning of a very good effort in Tbt. The reason I say this is, even while it is very difficult to quantify, the effort to quantify should never stop. I remember many years back when I entered a gym in one of the gyms when I was studying in university. In the frontal was written, "What cannot be quantified cannot be improved." Similarly, notwithstanding how difficult we have our task cut out here, if we cannot quantify, we cannot improve. So that quantification has to start, and it has started earnestly. It is difficult, but we need to quantify. But quantification itself, will it lead to results? Perhaps it may not. It reminds me of that usual joke that has in our whenever we want to talk about how numbers can mislead you. If somebody is suffering from high temperature, you put his head in the refrigerator, he will become cooler on the top part, and then his body temperature is hot, and then the average temperature is 28 degrees body, and then you have a normal human being. Maybe in that effort, we end up killing somebody. That's how numbers are there. But then when we start looking at the numbers do tell us something, like what just now Lucian said. The resolved STCs had 83 billion impact on the European Union overall. And like what I was just noting this slide. of Rainer, about 140 billion is related to STCs only on minerals, fuels, and oils and waxes. So perhaps there is a need to start somewhere and keep moving towards finding a right balance between where we have quality and quantity. Sarah, replying to your question, what did I take away from the room in the morning discussion and from my earlier experiences? It becomes very clear, perhaps after a point, the hard rules do not really give us the same kind of result as we aspire for. The time for creating soft rules, for guidelines, for recommendations is now, and Tbt is on top of it. We can draw inspiration from, just as everyone said, the other committees or the reform process of WTO has to draw inspiration from Tbt work. I would also say this exercise can also draw inspiration from the Financial Action Task Force. If some of you know what this is the intergovernmental agency which works on money laundering and financing of terrorist activities. This is not a treaty. Unlike we have the WTO agreement, this is an intergovernmental body which has got 40 recommendations. Trust me on this. If the sovereigns today worry about any one particular agency, which is not even a treaty, it is FATF. If recommendations can have such strong influence on the performance or how countries or how states conduct themselves, I think it is time for us to take cue from them and learn and incorporate in our own functioning. I stop there, Sarah. I know you had already flagged that would be a shortened time.
Thank you, Anwar, for these reflections and also drawing linkages to another sort of soft guidance that can make a huge difference for on the ground. So unfortunately, we don't have too much time, but I'd like to open the floor for questions. I'm not sure if there are any questions on the chat or in this room. Now is the moment to pose your question. Thank you. Yeah, I think Eric Wickstrom, the secretary of the Tbt Committee, has a question. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe just to break the ice, although I know time is short, but on the economics issue here, one thing that I still find puzzling, although I think, Lushan, you went into this to some extent, is as was said at the very beginning, a regulation has positive and negative sides, and the effects on trade are always mixed. You regulate for a certain reason, for instance, the protection of health or the environment. So it is by necessity the fact that a regulation will have an impact on trade that might be negative, but that negative impact might be precisely why you regulate. So do you consider that a cost or is it a benefit? In a sense, you have to look at it from a welfare perspective. And I wonder how one of the tricky things with regulation is exactly finding or striking that balance between the cost, which might be a reduction of trade, but the benefit you achieve by the regulation itself. This is a general question to any of you, but others from the floor can come in on this as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. I don't know if any of the panelists or even anyone from the floor would like to take the floor. I think, yeah, we have a speaker from the back, Christian from UNCTAD. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks to the panel and also to Eric for the question. I take this opportunity to quickly respond both to the question and also plug UNCTAD's work ever so slightly, if you allow me. So as some of you may know, UNCTAD has worked on regulatory transparency on non-tariff measures and of course, including technical barriers to trade for decades. And we've collected data in over 100 countries and covering over 90% of world trade. And among the almost 100,000 non-tariff measures that we've collected and classified in our database, 47% are Tbt, 38% are SPS, and well, that leaves only about 15% for all of the other non-tariff measures. So this data collection is really trying to create a comprehensive stock of regulations. So that distinguishes it from the flow type of information that WTO notifications are, and also distinguishes it from the special trade concerns, which highlight, to be politically correct, concerns. And now getting closer to Eric's question or point there, based on this comprehensive data set, rather than the specifically highlighted STCs or concerns, we estimated that the average ad valorem equivalent cost of TBT is anywhere between 3 and 8%. Of course, varying very much with sector and country. Generally, the tendency is that developed countries and least developed countries have lower restrictiveness, whereas developed countries have a higher restrictiveness. But even though these 3 to 8% might sound relatively moderate to some of you, they do certainly hide the devil, which in TBT is always in the detail. So they hide certainly much more restrictive and often prohibitive measures, which might then also be picked up by the STCs. But even these relatively moderate global averages would account then for an average global cost annually of $1.3 trillion. So by no means peanuts. But they're also less restrictive and even sometimes trade promoting TBT. There's indeed evidence in research, not from UNCTAD in this case, but out there in the proper academia, that well-implemented TBT can increase trust and therefore also trade. Well, in this context, it's really unfortunate, and maybe picking up on the joke of the sexiness today, that TBT are stigmatized across the board as barriers, rather than maybe neutrally named measures or regulations. And of course, the word technical doesn't really help, because it's probably the least sexy word that most people can think of. But well, the jokes and trade aside, there's of course the primary regulatory objectives of TBT, which contribute to sustainable trade and sustainable production in the broader sense. Our research has indeed suggested a statistical analysis of our data that about 60% of TBT can directly be matched to sustainable development goals and their targets, covering topics ranging far and wide, from pollution, endangered species, fishing, deforestation, energy efficiency, etc. And we're currently working specifically on TBT that concern climate change. So stay tuned for some publications coming from UNCTAD. Talking about publications, of course, I could go on for much longer, but I won't. Because we have this one publication called Non-Tariff Measures from A to Z, which summarizes everything we've done over the last years. And each chapter covering different topics has a further reading section. So from there, you can find everything we do. Just one highlight to really end it, sorry, Sarah, is that we estimate that about 25% of TBT-related costs can be eliminated through regulatory cooperation. Also, the OECD has found that 25% can be reduced through increased transparency. And with that, closing with the conclusion that the work here is incredibly important in the TBT committee and might even eclipse most of the work done in the rest of the organization. So thank you very much, and sorry for extending a bit too much.
Thank you, Christian. I wish we had a bit more time, but I think you brought some very valuable information to the discussion in terms of the facts and figures we are after, and also the benefits, continued benefits we can have from further engagement with the committee. I think there was another hand in the back from Arso. Very quickly, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you also for inviting us for this symposium. I've got just one concern about the STCs. I'm wondering, in a case where since the Wto Tbt Committee was set up and going through and is trying to resolve STCs, has there been a case where totally the STC has failed to be resolved within this set the jurisdiction of the Wto Tbt Committee? Because I know cases whereby normally parties are advised to do bilateral understanding among themselves. What happens if the bilateral consultations also fail? Then secondly, when that one happens and it is out of the Wto Tbt committee jurisdiction, are there cases where people can end up in international commercial court to resolve them? Because I know what can happen in Africa is we end up closing borders and we stop trade. What are the situation in the international arena to resolve such STCs? And if there is any which has happened that completely we fail to resolve an STC? Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think I'll see if panelists wish to respond to that question, and then we'll wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Just maybe to briefly say that, of course, the process of discussing STCs in the TBT committee doesn't guarantee a resolution or a positive outcome. We know that there are, and there are many different types of STCs, some which are raised for 1 or 2 meetings, and then they disappear from the agenda, presumably because a positive outcome has been found. There are other of these trade concerns which are discussed for many years, sometimes up to 10 years in a row. And for those, probably you could say, well, there's still an issue. But the fact that they're still being discussed in the committee also can be seen in and of itself a success, because it hasn't been then elevated to the dispute settlement process in the WTO. So that function of preventing disputes and continuing the regulatory dialogue can also be positive. Thank you.
Thank you, Devin. Now I'd like to see if our other panelists wish to make very, very quick remarks before we conclude, maybe responding also to some of the issues that just came up.
Thank you, sir. I'll probably just focus on the question that Eric raised, since the other questions were very eloquently covered already. I think it's an extremely important point to look at the underlying logic behind different regulatory initiatives that all WTO members have put in place over time, and we will continue to do so in the future, perhaps even more so in these new areas that need new regulations: climate, sustainability, digital, cybersecurity, etc. So since if I'm not mistaken, today is also the World Standards Day, and to take your example about the unknown cricket player, I think international standards perform that function, and that's why sometimes we only focus on the ones that create problems. But the biggest success story is, I think, that the thousands of regulatory initiatives that we have all put in place, which did not create problems. Why? Very often because we all adopted these technical regulation norms and legislation on the basis of international standards. So I'd like to echo, I think, the implicit answer in your question, Eric, that indeed, maybe what we are discussing today, specific trade concerns, are the tip of an iceberg, but the iceberg is a much more positive story about cooperation, adoption of good regulatory practices based on international standards. So indeed, there is a lot to be said about the way in which we rely on such good practices already. Thank you.
Quickly, just a minute answer to the gentleman at the far end. If you notice, there were more than 46,000 STCs raised since 95, out of which only 46,000 notifications were issued to TBT, out of which only 750 STCs were raised. Even among 750 STCs, only 50 have gone to the dispute level. So in terms of the percentage, if you see, of the total notifications, only 2% of the notifications have gone towards STCs. And among the STCs, only less than 8% have gone to the disputes. So that in some sense gives you how and what the committee's work is and how issues can be resolved even before they have gone to the disputes. I hope that is helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucian and Anwar. I think we could have continued a bit more, but I think given that we have another very interesting panel coming up, we will have to wrap up. I think we heard some very useful about some very useful studies regarding the magnitude of trade affected by regulations and the discussions in the committee. I think it's also evident that more can be done, more digging can be done, it can be looked at from different perspectives. And there, in terms of how we can improve this number crunching, one of the issues suggested in terms of follow-up was to improve HS codes, provision and notifications, a very technical issue. But this is also an issue the committee is actually looking at the moment as part of its work program after the trial review. And I guess also that while we dig into the numbers, we also have to spread the message. So go deep, but also go broad and see how this information can be spread to those who are not following such symposia like this one. Then maybe I'll take the privilege of having the mic as the moderator to also recall that notifications are the precursor often of STCs, and that the Secretariat is also compiling little case studies of how notifications have helped resolve specific anecdotal issues, whether if it sparked an adjustment by companies in a country, whether failure to spot a notification led to rejections at the border, or how commenting helped improve our regulations. So just a plea, if any one of you following has such examples to share from the private sector, please do not hesitate to contact us. So I think I'd like to thank at this stage all the panelists, and hope that we can continue this conversation at future occasions. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, joining us both online and in the room, welcome to the third segment of this event on easing regulatory bottlenecks organized by the WTO Secretariat. I will give 1 minute for some participants to wrap up, and then we will begin. So welcome once again to this event. My name is Mateo Ferrero. I work at the Trade and Environment Division of the WTO, and I'm very pleased to be the moderator of this third session. This third segment will take the form of a regulatory policy dialogue that seeks to examine 3 policy areas in which regulatory bottlenecks can have a significant impact on supply chains: environmental protection, public health, and the dissemination of new digital technologies. To examine these issues, we're privileged to count on a stellar group of speakers to help us better understand why regulatory bottlenecks arise in these areas and how more cooperation on regulations and standards at the multilateral level can help reduce negative impacts on supply chains in the future. Let me begin with a very short round of introductions. First, we have joining us online Diane Würzberger from GE Healthcare, where she is an executive of regulatory affairs and quality and works on global regulatory policy. Second, here in the room on my left, we have Dongming Jie, who is Vice President of the China Automobile Standards Internationalization Center in Geneva. Third, joining us online as well, we have Wael Diab, an expert in the information technology industry, who is the chair of the ISO-IEC International Standardization Committee working on artificial intelligence. And last, but certainly not least, we also have joining us online Chad Bown, an expert on international trade policy, who is Reginald Jones Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C. Before we start, I would like to thank our speakers for being with us today, and a special thanks to those speakers joining us virtually, as they are in the early hours of the morning on the other side of the Atlantic, and I think in one case in the very, very early hours of the morning. So thank you all. Before starting with my questions, allow me to say a few words to set the scene. In this dialogue, I would like us to focus on 3 key regulatory areas that have been rising in prominence in the work of the Tbt Committee. First, in the area of environmental protection, we have seen a steady increase in the number of Tbt measures notified to the WTO since 1995, almost 5,000 Tbt measures with that objective. In today's dialogue, we will examine the policy objective of environmental protection through the lens of the automotive industry, as it provides an interesting case study that may shed light on key regulatory challenges that need to be addressed to accelerate the decarbonization of road transport. Second, turning to public health, there is no need to remind everyone that over the last couple of years, we have been witness to an unprecedented public health emergency in the form of the COVID-19 pandemic. But what should be highlighted is that many WTO members had to solve trade-related bottlenecks early on in the pandemic in order to address the public health emergency. There are many lessons from that experience that we will explore today in our discussion. And the third topic of this discussion is the emergence of new digital technologies. There is a growing number of Tbt notifications and STCs in this area, for instance, dealing with artificial intelligence, cybersecurity issues, encryption requirement, autonomous vehicles, to name just a few. So against this backdrop, our speakers today will share a few key challenges and opportunities related to the regulation of this new industry. Let me now say a word on housekeeping arrangements. First, I will conduct a couple of rounds of questions with our speakers, and then towards the end of the session, I will open the floor to the audience in the room and online for Q&A sessions. For those of you joining us online, if you have any questions, do feel free to put them in the Q&A chat box, and we will try to address as many of them as possible in the Q&A session. So without any further ado, I would like to turn to our speakers to explore in more detail the impact of regulatory bottlenecks on supply chains. Let's start in the area of public health. The COVID-19 pandemic confronted authorities across the globe with a number of unprecedented challenges. Authorities had to react quickly to the public health emergency to ensure both the availability and the quality of essential medical goods. So Diane, I would like to start with a question to you. What lessons can we learn from the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of regulatory flexibilities that were introduced to facilitate international trade in key medical goods such as medical devices, diagnostics, and PPE? You have the floor.
Thank you, Mateo. First, I'd like to thank the WTO for the opportunity to address this timely subject as a part of this policy dialogue today. It's an honor to present the views of the global medical technology industry with these esteemed panelists. In my role at GE Healthcare, I have the opportunity to support the work of the Global Medical Technology Alliance and chair AdvaMed's Global Regulatory Harmonization Working Group. These initiatives are focused on working globally to align regulations and remove barriers to medtech supply chain. Among other things, the past few years have taught us that regulatory misalignment is not only a major impediment to trade, but more importantly, it hinders the health industry's ability to respond quickly and efficiently in a crisis. In our industry's experience, working with national regulatory authorities around the world, one of the most significant contributors of regulatory misalignment in the medtech supply chain is lack of implementation of the Wto Tbt Agreement. Unfortunately, most medtech national regulatory authorities have fallen short of implementing the Tbt Agreement, likely due to lack of awareness, I should say, and sufficient resources. This was already the situation before the pandemic, but the COVID-19 experience made it even more evident. National regulatory authorities that had policies in place implementing the Tbt Agreement, for example, basing regulations on relevant international consensus standards, had more integrated regulatory capacity and flexibility to meet the demand surges driven by the pandemic. When a national regulatory authority has implemented national technical regulations based upon the relevant international standards, for example, if we consider the ISO 13485 Medical Device Quality Management Systems standard, then there are a greater number of medical devices available that comply with this globally aligned standard. However, when a national regulatory authority has implemented specific national technical regulations that are unique and not based upon such relevant international standards, these differing regulations create unnecessary market entry hurdles and present technical barriers that then delay patient access to innovative technologies that improve and save lives. These regulatory hurdles can also impede market access and increase costs. The approach also creates additional strains on regulatory authorities that are already short on resources during a crisis. The authority often must deploy resources trained to identify and assess the medical devices to these unique national technical requirements. Of course, I have to note, all countries have the authority to protect the health and safety of their citizens and to establish laws and regulations to determine the safety and quality of healthcare products, including medical technologies, introduced on their territories. The medical technology industry supports good regulatory practices and a predictable regulatory system which ensures safety and efficacy of devices with regulations that are clear, consistent, efficient, and implemented in the least burdensome manner. Therefore, to better prepare for future health emergencies and to support regulatory agility during a crisis, we strongly encourage countries to have their medtech regulatory authorities develop and publish implementation plans for compliance with the Wto Tbt Agreement and base their requirements on international regulatory standards. For countries, such an approach will facilitate an environment conducive to growth of the medical technology sector, as well as promote patients' timely access to life-saving medical technologies, which is critical during the time of a pandemic.
Thank you very much, Diane, for offering some very interesting insights on perhaps the unique challenges that the healthcare industry and regulators in this area face, particularly in situations like a pandemic. Let's turn now to the automotive industry. The auto industry relies on complex supply chains across multiple countries and is subject to numerous regulations and standards. These requirements may be in place to pursue a wide variety of policy objectives, which may include safety, environmental protection, and climate change mitigation. My question to you, Dong-Ming, would be, could you give us a sense of the different types of regulations and standards that the car industry needs to comply with? And I understand that in answering this question, you would like to use a slide, so I would kindly request my colleague to project it on the screen while you answer. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone. As Matthew said, the automobile industry is quite dependent on international trade and also international regulations and standards. As I concluded, the vehicle regulations and standards, we have two levels. The first level is the international level. We have some leading organization is UNECE. They make nearly more than 160 regulations for vehicle safety, for environmental protection, and also for the automated driving, some digital technology. And below that, it's ISO, IEC, and ITU. Like the ISO, they have nearly more than 1,000 standards, which support the whole international regulation system and also support the development of technology for the automobile industry. And also the IEC, they focused a lot on the electric vehicle industry, and also the ITU, who focused on the automated driving. And this is the international level, and below that is a different country. They have a different kind of request or requirement. Like in China, we have national mandatory standards, which is more or less like our regulations. And the number is nearly 130, which is a little lower than the request from the UN regulation. And we also have our recommended standards, which is more or less introduced from the ISO or IEC system. The number we have is nearly 400. So the automobile industry, the problem they met is now they need to meet nearly hundreds of regulations and thousands of standards from more than 100 countries. That's the current situation. But the base for the whole system is the international regulation system and the international standards system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dong-Ming, for shedding some light on the vast magnitude and nature of the regulations that have to be sort of dealt with by the car industry. I would like to turn now to the emerging digital technologies industry, which are increasingly touching more and more parts of our lives and societies. Given that the deployment of these new technologies may carry certain risks related to cybersecurity, privacy concerns, and even ethical concerns, governments are increasingly developing regulations in this area. So while I would like to bring you in at this point, what are the main challenges in regulating and developing standards in the area of emerging digital technologies, such as artificial intelligence? Could you share with us an example that illustrates why this can be particularly challenging? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. And I would also like to thank the WTO for extending the opportunity for us to share, the insights from ISO and IEC on some of these aspects. As the prior esteemed speakers have also noted, international voluntary standards, such as those developed by IEC and ISO, are crucial in terms of helping enable trade and dealing with some of the emerging issues like the ones that I'm going to talk about. Just to give a little bit of perspective, as before I answer the question in detail, I chair the committee that is jointly between ISO and IEC on artificial intelligence. ISO and IEC through the JTC1 program have a family of standards that deal with information technology. Committee 42 was created for artificial intelligence, and we are scoped to lead that perspective on AI from the IT point of view, but also to provide guidance on the development of AI applications for committees within ISO, IEC, and JTC1. We currently have 50 countries that participate in the development of our work. We typically have 250 plus delegates at our meeting and have established an ecosystem of liaisons with about 50 other committees and organizations. So to address the question, I believe that I had sent in a slide that might be nice to show if possible. One of the things that we see as technology continues to change and its impact on not just our work, but how we live and how we enjoy ourselves, is the fact that, you know, it's no longer just important for the people that are developing the technology to be engaged in the standardization, but also the people that use it. And the chart that I have is what we call the ecosystem approach that we are using within the Committee on AI to take a look at how we do standardization. And the key thing here is to understand the context of use of the technology. So if you look at the top of the diagram, we have, you know, the traditional sort of business requirements that would come into developing standardization around the technology. But we also have, as we have heard, you know, or will continue to hear on this panel and some of the previous discussions, emerging social requirements around things like the use of data, ethical approach to artificial intelligence, and so on, regulatory and policy requirements that we are working closely in collaboration with a number of entities in this area early on in the standardization process. And then, of course, ensuring that the standards that we develop would also help application domains. So in order to do that, in order to be horizontal, we have to engage with the application domains. So we go through this process of assimilating all of these requirements. In the case of my committee, we deal with artificial intelligence, big data, and the application to analytics. We then develop what we call horizontal and foundational projects. There are examples of those on the screen, things from foundational concepts. So something, for example, that would talk about terminology. I think a lot of us that went through the 90s and we're talking about the information superhighway, remember that could have meant dial-up modem, satellite communication, or fiber communication. So it's important to have common language. And then to everything in terms of reference frameworks, application guidance, and so on. But the story does not stop there. So in the case, for example, of ISO and IEC, there are plenty of technical committees that would be developing standards in the domain areas that would then leverage these horizontal standardizations. So to go back to the question, you know, what are some of the challenges? Well, unlike in the past, we are not developing the technology first and then standardizing its interoperability and thinking about some of the consequences that might come in later, but we are looking at the full life cycle up front, including things like regulatory requirements, which in today's world would include things such as, you know, ethical considerations, data considerations, and so on.
Thank you very much, Wael. Thank you very much, Wael, for illustrating so well the complexity of regulating this sort of novel industry. I would now like to turn to Chad and maybe to provide some horizontal perspective in these three areas that we've been touching upon. I would like to ask you the following question, Chad. What are some of the key challenges that governments face to avoid regulatory bottlenecks affecting products that may play an important role in addressing current global challenges? For example, electric vehicles to mitigate climate change, or the dissemination of medical goods to solve public health emergencies. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Matteo. And it's a huge pleasure to join everybody. Thanks, Eric, also for organizing. And it's good to see so many friends there in Geneva. I saw Christian in the earlier session. It reminded me of my days when I was helping to collect data on non-tariff measures and all the challenges that get faced by us seeking to analyze these things. So I guess where I would start on this issue is recognizing that we are in a new reality from probably how we thought about these issues, the seriousness of a lot of these issues, say 3, 4, or 5 years ago. Given that the health trauma that we all went through, which provided, I think, a lot of us extremely useful real-world experiences that we should now take forward and put into practice. The more challenging geopolitical climate in terms of countries not getting along for non-trade reasons. But also, I think the recognition and the open question as to whether the current system that we have, the current sort of economic system that we have in place today is fit for purpose in terms of the geographic location of economic activity in certain sectors, or whether it might be too geographically concentrated in a world that's now more exposed to certain types of geographic shocks, whether they're health related and you might have lockdowns, whether they're climate related and we have greater incidence of unbelievably powered storms or droughts, or of course, the challenging geopolitics. And I think what that means is our traditional approach of, let's sort of get out of the way and let's encourage policymakers to get out of the way, to develop good regulatory practices, but then let markets sort things out and we can share. Maybe that's not the entire story going forward in ways that we need to think about that are slightly differently from what we have in the past. So I guess what I would pose for us as a question, probably for each of our speakers, and I see myself more as a provocateur than necessarily being able to answer these questions for our industry experts. But suppose that is the case, right? I think that the basic WTO principles in this area are critical. So I'm not suggesting that we should stray too far from national treatment, from MFN, so key, non-discriminatory principles. Obviously, transparency and notifications are important. But when we're thinking about the need to really accelerate, say, EVs, if countries are going to do things like what we have seen recently in the United States through the Inflation Reduction Act, which on the one hand is an incredible step forward in subsidizing consumers to switch toward the activity that we want them to be doing. But in there, it's also creating very strong incentives that are going to have impacts on supply chains. Well, when we see those kinds of things happen, we should be asking governments perhaps a little bit more, like, tell us about what your objectives are here, so that we can then try to evaluate them with some numbers. So if part of the argument of this is, well, with markets, we would have too much geographic concentration of critical minerals or components for batteries in certain geographic locations of the world, and we need diversification. Okay, but let's put some numbers on. Let's suppose that's a legitimate objective. What are the costs associated with that? And is this really the best way, or what are the unintended consequences of doing something like that? And we can come up with examples there for medical countermeasures as well. We saw obviously during the pandemic, if you think about things like vaccines, it was unprecedented in terms of speed and scale. But at the end of the day, we ended up with much more production coming out of relatively few places. If we're going to talk about increased diversification globally for, say, vaccine manufacturing in future, okay, but is that going to come at the cost of scale and speed in terms of being able to respond to future health emergencies? In any case, these are the kinds of questions that we need to now struggle with. And given that we have the experience of the last couple of years, I think it's time to put the analytics around some of that and put some cost and benefit to the test here as well.
Thank you very much, Chad, for offering these very interesting perspectives and bringing perhaps some of the new geopolitical realities we're living in. Before turning to a second round of questions, I would like to pause for a moment to see if any of our three speakers would like to react to maybe some of Chad's comments, Diane, Wael, or Dongming. Maybe let's then turn to the second round, and of course you're always free to jump in and maybe address some of those comments. So in this second round of questions, I would like to focus the discussion on the role of international cooperation and the importance of international standards to avoid regulatory bottlenecks. So let's start with international cooperation related to the auto industry. Dongming, I would like to ask you three related questions. First, how do international standards apply to the car industry? Second, what are the benefits of international cooperation in this area? And third, how does the Tbt Committee support such cooperation? You have the floor. Thank you very much.
Okay, for this section, I also prepared two pages for that. Hope we can show this. Yes, it's this page first. For the application for international standard, I use two blocks. The first block is blue color. We call it international parts. In this part, we have international regulations and which is supported by the international standards, and also some regional standards, and also some association from our industry, like the car manufacturer, spare parts, the suppliers association. But generally speaking, this kind of international system, the threshold is very high. I have checked very carefully for the whole international regulation and standardization system. For the automobile industry, the active participating countries and regions, the number is nearly only 40. So the problem is how is the other side of the world, how is the other more than 100 countries. And in the other hand, we have different countries and regions. We have our regulations, standards also. That means the Wto Tbt, who works based on the members and has only the obligation for the countries and the regions standards. But why I mentioned the international system a lot here, because the international system, the regulation and the standards many times influence a lot on the countries and the regions, regulations and the standards. That's also the path, the first question, the path, how the international system influence the industry. And for the cooperation, as I mentioned, yes, there's really a lot of cooperation. There's many countries who take part in, but because of the reason this threshold is very high, for most developing countries, they are very difficult to organize the resource and the technology to take part in the international standards and also the international regulation system. So it's lack of the participating from some countries. And finally, what I want the support from the side of the WTO is I hope that WTO can organize all your members to take part in the international system, because many times you get comments from the countries' regulations, or you get the STC for different countries' regulation. But finally, this kind of a question may be caused from the international regulations and standards, or it's a problem between the international regulations and some countries' regulations. So I hope the WTO can organize more developing countries to take part in the activity. And meanwhile, the WTO Tbt, you can coordinate the different opinions between international organizations and coordinate the differences between international organizations and the countries and the regions. That's my reply. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dongming, for giving us those interesting insights on the importance of cooperation in the auto industry, and also for underscoring, of course, the importance of increasing wider participation in international standard setting activities in this industry. Let's turn now to examine international cooperation in the area of public health. Diane, in order to attain our public health objectives, how can we better leverage existing regulatory cooperation arrangements, such as the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, the African Medical Devices Forum, or the Asian Harmonization Working Party? You have the floor.
Thank you. I think this is a great question and an excellent opportunity to highlight the intersection of trade commitments and health regulation, specifically the WHO guidance for MedTech national regulatory authorities, which is aligned with that of the WTO. In fact, the WHO Global Model Regulatory Framework encourages national regulatory authorities to use international standards as a basis for their national technical regulations, to engage in regulatory reliance and recognition, to work within their scarce resources, and to avoid creating country-unique medtech regulations. These WHO recommendations are aligned with the TBT agreement, even though in a bit of a different context. And of course, although ministries of health and national regulatory authorities take the lead role on health, trade and trade ministries have their critical supporting roles as well in healthcare. Because without trade and trade rules, the medical device supply chains do not function and critical technologies cannot reach patients in hospitals. So perhaps I can make 3 recommendations of things that can be done to assist in the effort. Number 1, national regulatory authorities can establish a goal of developing zero medtech technical regulations and standards that are not based upon relevant international standards. This may sound a bit extreme, but this is what regulatory convergence looks like in practice. And it's part of the work that we're seeing in such forums as the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. We cannot commit to the TBT agreement and regulatory convergence without prioritizing one standard for any given medtech scope. Secondly, medtech national regulatory authorities can designate a person on their staffs whose responsibility it is to be familiar with the relevant international medtech standards and to prioritize basing their technical regulations upon them. And third, the national regulatory authorities, medtech companies, and other stakeholders should expand and prioritize their engagement and activities of such international forums to be familiar with the relevant international reference documents and the work that's being done there. These forums include, as noted, the International Medical Device Regulations Forum, the African Medical Device Forum, and the Global Harmonization Working Party, but also, and significantly, the standards development organizations such as ISO and IEC to maximize global efforts towards standards, conformity assessment, and regulatory convergence. All of these can be leveraged. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diane. I think you offered us some very interesting perspectives, including on how international standards can be used in situations where the human resource in regulators can be scarce, and therefore there is that opportunity there to be benefited from. Let's turn now to examine international cooperation in emerging digital technologies. Wael, could you share with us an example of how the development of international standards has contributed to responsible and broad adoption of digital transformation technologies, such as artificial intelligence, across countries? The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Matteo, for the question. Yeah, so as noted in the question, AI is a key enabler of digital transformation technologies. And I would note that, before we talk about how AI is different, AI does share a tremendous amount of commonality with existing IT technologies and their application. So by its nature being an IT technology, there's a tremendous body of work of standards that exists both at the IT level as well as the operational, the OT level, or the application domain levels that would still be applicable. However, having said that, AI also has unique aspects that are different than traditional IT systems, specifically, the learning aspect of the technology. As many of us have either experienced with AI or have heard, AI has this notion that it can learn, so it looks at lots of data sets. So again, on that level, there's lots of standards that apply around trustworthiness, around the use of IT within existing, within domains. However, we are developing standards to deal with these gaps and differences. And as an example, I'm going to look at, what it means to have a standard around something like AI ethics. And so AI ethics has been top of mind for lots of people in this segment. And one of the things that we look at when we look at AI ethics is how can we make broad recommendations? And what we see are a couple of things. The first thing is we see quite a bit of commonality across domains rather than regions. So this may be a little counterintuitive, but if I was to use an example of the use of technology, I have a 6-year-old son. The way he interacts with technology and the way I interact with technology are different, even though, we are living in the same place, in the same culture. As it turns out, when we look at how different domains would like to use IT, and in this case, AI, we find a lot of commonality within the concerns. For example, if you're running a smart factory, or if you're trying to look at it for a medical application, or if you're trying to look at it for a financial application. So what we do is we use the international tools that we have, or the international standards tools, and as an initial step, ingest use cases and ask about what the ethical concerns are. We then turn around and tie this to the development of work that we do, trying to have a broad horizontal set of tools that can then be picked up and used by the different domains. And the different domains can then decide how they would like to tune these tools for their particular use. It's very clear that, someone looking at a financial system would have very different concerns from someone that's looking at a smart factory. And so, kind of looking at it from that perspective, we find that these standards are not only globally applicable, but they are helping deal with a problem up front that and giving it a structured way in order to both deal with it at the IT level and then at the application domain level. I would also be remiss if I didn't note that, this is not just something that, my committee would work on, but we do it, like I mentioned, working with the application domains, but also in collaboration internationally with a lot of other entities. For instance, we have been participating on the UNESCO expert group. We work closely with OECDs and a number of other organizations. So again, standards here can not only be part of the solution, they can help enable bringing a voluntary international standard and putting structure around the problem that otherwise would seem quite difficult to deal with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wael, for sharing with us that interesting example and also explaining to us how there is both the ability of relying on a body of work that exists in related industries, but also how important it is to bear in mind the specifics of your challenges dealing with artificial intelligence. So the last question of the second round would be to Chad. Chad, we've heard about a very sort of knowledgeable set of speakers in very specific sectors and how international cooperation can be used to ease bottlenecks affecting these sectors. I would like to now place the focus on the role of the WTO. So my question to you would be, how can the WTO support greater regulatory coherence in areas that can help governments solve important policy problems, including those related to climate change, public health, and digitalization? Over to you.
So I think this is a hugely important question. What can the WTO do? I think the first thing it needs to do is to recognize the huge priority that governments are placing on this very issue and think about what it might need to do to reorganize itself to be able to meet the demand that member countries have, that so far they're looking for this elsewhere. And, as we think about the historical evolution of this, again, I'm in Washington here in the United States. The original negotiations with the EU through the TTIP agreement were all about sort of regulatory cooperation and trying to deal with some of these regulatory bottlenecks. Big part of the TPP from the US side was dealing with things like regulatory coherence. Right now, the current US administration with the EU, they're not negotiating a free trade agreement. They've got this Trade and Technology Council that's very much dealing with these kinds of things that come up. The new IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, it's not about negotiating tariff reductions. It's helping to secure resilient supply chains and deal with potential regulatory bottlenecks and helping to figure those things out. So this is clearly what governments want international cooperation to look like. The question is how can the WTO best engage on this? I think a couple of things. One, sort of its continued work is excellent, providing the safe space through the STC process to get a lot of the concerns heard in a reasonably collaborative manner, I think is useful. But I think we've also seen both through the pandemic, through the recent worries about food insecurity, that the WTO, when prodded, can actually do a bit more and actually be somewhat of a problem solver and take a more activist role and help when emergencies in crises erupt. And I would encourage more of that. What we're missing in terms of international cooperation at the moment, and I think now, even in the context, if we think about, say the vaccine challenges that we saw, what were the big impediments there for something like what a role that the WTO on the supply side might play? And I'm just going to abstract from distributional issues and allocation issues globally, but just getting more vaccines manufactured as quickly as possible, while recognizing that we had things like input shortages, and some of that was with global supply chains. Input providers are in different countries. We need to subsidize those folks. Well, the WTO historically has never really coordinated on how to subsidize and offer subsidies. We've only coordinated on how to convince governments not to subsidize. We've established a rule book for that, but we have to also recognize in certain moments, we need to enact subsidies. We need to trigger them. We need to do them efficiently. We need to know who to subsidize. We need to understand supply chains. Who in the world is best positioned to do that? The WTO, not the WHO, not UNCTAD, not the World Bank, not the IMF, supply chains, the WTO. Get active in that space. But that means more than just policy surveillance now. Now we need to start to think about market surveillance, what we've been doing with agricultural products since the onset of the food crisis in 2007, 8, 9. The G20 came out with AMIS, the Agricultural Market Information System. We need certain things like that for certain types of medical countermeasures. In any case, there are massively proactive things that the WTO, I think, could be doing to engage on these issues. Some of them are regulatory, some of them may not be. Some of them may be more fiscal, but nobody else in the international cooperation space is doing it. They typically always involve supply chains that are now global. And thus, I think there really is a huge role for the WTO to engage on really what is currently an unmet demand by the international community.
Thank you very much, Chad, for that food for thought. And if I may say, for the nudge in terms of suggesting ways in which the WTO and the Tbt Committee can continue to improve in order to better deliver to its members and, of course, the citizens in those members. So thank you very much for those remarks. So we're going to close our second round of questions here, and we're going to turn to our Q&A session. I would like to thank our speakers for their insights so far. So I would want to open the floor for questions, both to people in the room and online. We'll try to gather a few questions at once, and then I'll give the floor back to the speakers to answer them. So who would have a question? And I think maybe Eric here on my right is going to help me with the questions from the chat. I think I see one hand over here and another one over there. So maybe first you have the floor, Renee.
I wanted to thank the speakers for their very interesting presentations. I noted that all of the speakers in this last panel recognize the importance of international standards to address regulatory bottlenecks, but the TBT committee works on both standards and conformity assessment. The agreement covers those two areas. And so I wanted to ask what might be done in the area of conformity assessment with testing accreditation to address, move towards greater regulatory convergence in the areas of autos and ICT and health. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Renee. Is there another question in the room? Maybe at the back. Laura, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mateo, and thank you for the three speakers' excellent presentations. So my question perhaps is maybe jointly to Diane and Wael. It's, as you know, the Tbt Committee adopted in the year 2000 the 6 principles of international standards. So I keep again with the issue of international standards, and one of them is coherence across international standardizing bodies. In other words, avoiding conflicting standard setting with respect to the same products or the same situations. And I recall that in the beginning, the DG program mentioned this, emerging Internet of Things when products are becoming smarter. There is this cross fertilization between digital and the physical products, and then thinking about health and digital here, two of the presentations, there is this phenomenon of digital biological conversion. You have medical devices becoming increasingly digital devices as well. And then, normally standardization has in the field of, in the sector or the domain of health has been done in one part, in the digital or electronic in another part. But when these things are converging now, how do you ensure, and what is your view in terms of ensuring that standard setting is coherent in this area when products are converging? So we don't have contradictions and consequently effect of trade and more efficiency. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura, for that question. And now I will give the floor to Eric to pose the questions from the chat. Eric, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. So one is actually not from the chat. It's from me to Chad here, and it's on your question about the prodding. I'd like to prod you a little bit more on that one, and I'm setting the subsidies aside and focusing on the regulatory area. I mean, one thing that we struggle with, or at least I struggle with, is that of course governments regulate. So what role does WTO have to push in any one direction? And of course, the Tbt agreement is pretty much set, and I don't see any Tbt agreement version 3. We had the standards code, maybe that's the first one, and the current one is the second one. So in the absence of new hard rules, and the fact that we are working on some soft rules, where is how can we be prodded, so to speak? And I mean, I struggle with this, and I see your point, and I know I'm putting you in a bit of a difficult position here, but I mean, personally, I think, for instance, there are good regulatory practices, the development of these good practices, the encouragement of looking more at less fragmentation in the standards world. These are thoughts, but if you had any thoughts at all on this would be really useful. One quickly from the web, from the participants virtually. I think while you address this to some extent, but it has to do with standard setting in the area of AI, which is often, there's a lot of values and ethics involved, and standard setting people tend to be very technical. So how do you bring in these issues in standard setting? And don't you cross a line in some senses, because we often have the notion that standards are technical, government set policy. But here, when you get into AI, you have a bit of a mix. So I guess that's a bit of a challenge. I think I'm paraphrasing a little bit the question that was there. Thanks.
Thank you very much to everyone in the audience for those questions. So maybe I will give the floor to all speakers, because I think there are questions to everyone. But maybe just to recap, we have a question from Renee on maybe focusing on the area of standards and conformity assessment procedures across the three industries, autos, health, and IT. We have a question from Lauro in terms of the 6 principles and the importance of coherence, and then how we are entering this world in which medical devices and IT products are becoming more and more intertwined. We have a question to Chad from Eric in terms of maybe what more can we do in terms of in the regulatory area. And then one final question to Wael, perhaps to speak on the ethical challenges in terms of standards for AI. So I will give the floor first to maybe Diane, and then we'll continue after that. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me see if I can remember some of those questions in my response. So I think to the question that Renee posed related to the opportunities with conformity assessment, I think the opportunities there are similar. And the national regulatory authorities, as well as all stakeholders, have the opportunity to leverage what's been done and to move towards perhaps the opportunity of alliance, right? And ensure that if there is a standard in place and the conformity assessment is determining by one national regulatory authority, as an example, that a device, a process that is meeting that standard, that others are more confident in that process or product and can rely more and perhaps reduce some of the burden of duplicating work and creating new efforts and assessments on top of what's already been done. So I think that there's quite a parallel opportunity there, similar to, again, looking at relying on international standards and basing national regulatory requirements for regulations and standards on those. There was a question also related to the 6 principles and how do we ensure that there is no conflict and coherence. I think what's really critical in all of this is the continued cooperation and collaboration across stakeholders, that all stakeholders are understanding the various perspectives, opportunities, and challenges that are associated with bringing innovations to patients in a safe and effective manner, that they're aware of what exists today in terms of almost like an inventory of what exists in terms of standards and regulations. And then through that dialogue, identifying what really are the critical elements there and ensuring that we're not having conflicting requirements, ensuring that there's agreement on what are the most essential requirements and really harmonizing that approach. I think that will help to that dialogue and that collaboration across both the pre-market and post-market space is really essential and ensure that we are eliminating, at least reducing as much as possible that inconsistency and overlap.
Thank you very much, Diane. I will now give the floor to Dongming here on my left, and then I will give the floor to Wael and Chad, and I would simply kindly ask all speakers to keep their answers maybe to 2 minutes because we're starting to run out of time. Thank you.
Okay, very lucky. I have one more page prepared for the question from the USA. Yes, yes, because the automobile industry is really difficult. It's this year we have the lack of chips. The supply chain, we have big problems, and we also have a very long chain of standards and regulations. But besides that, we have a very long chain for certification also. We have first from the regulations and then for the type approval and the certification, and then when the cars are sold to the customers, they need to registration, and every year or several years, and they need the inspection. So it's a very, very long period and process. And for most of them, besides the regulation, they met a problem. Most of them is a conformity assessment procedure. And as we know in the Wto Tbt, they are developing the guidelines for that. And from the side of the international regulation level, they also have regulations, and they also exchange how to understand and how to carry out these kind of regulations. But I think that's not enough. So from the side of the Wto Tbt, I think it's very important to build up some kind of platform between members and also between publics, like the type of authorities and technical services, distributors and customers, to make everyone understanding some nuisance. Like the example, we in China now we are developing the battery swap. That means when your car, the electric car, if you want to travel a longer distance, now you need not recharge your car. Besides the highway, you only change your battery as you want, like the fuel station. So in that kind of situation, the manufacturers, they said that we have this problem in this country and a different problem in that country, and the complaints, it's a problem of the standards or regulations. But finally we found maybe not, because we use the same regulation or we use the same standards, but the only problem is different countries, they have different understanding. Or even from the level of the central government or from the level of the province or some counties, they have different kind of understanding. So that's why I insist the Wto Tbt, you should build up some kind of international for that, and also you need continue to promote. You build up some kind of guidelines for the conformity assessment procedure. And I also say Eric also visited the ISO meeting. For our side of ISO, they mentioned they also have some kind of conformity assessment procedure. I think maybe next step we can have cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dong-Ming. Now I would like to turn to Wael for his brief answer, and then to Chad. Wael, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. I'll make it very brief. I think there was 3 questions that touched on the areas I talked about. The first, an excellent question on conformity assessment. And in fact, I was just talking to some of the conveners in SC42 yesterday about this topic. So I would start by noting that both ISO and IEC have unique and comprehensive tools in this area, like CASCO and the conformity assessment program in the IEC. Specifically to artificial intelligence, one of the things that we have done to enable a conformity assessment, third-party audit and certification was to develop what it's the ISO IEC 42001. And this is a management system standard that's aimed at looking at the process by which AI is developed and can deal with some of the unique AI attributes in a very novel way. It also has the ability to bring all of our standards together in a way that can increase confidence for the end user. So if you're familiar with ISO 9001 or ISO IEC 27001, this is in the similar vein for artificial intelligence. It can also be extended for domains. So the way the standard is itself structured, the management system standard, there's a control section that can be extended for domains or particular uses or applications. On the question regarding stakeholders and how you are careful with ethics, I completely agree. We are a technical committee, and the key thing there is that we focus on the context of use of the technology. We are not a committee that would make recommendations on policy. That is for someone else to do. But we provide tools, and we try to do them, as I noted, in a very horizontal way and in collaboration with application domains that can then take those standards and tune them for their particular needs and their particular regulation needs in their domain. I would note that one of the things with my committee is it's brought together a very diverse set of stakeholders. So it's not just the data scientists, engineers, and marketeers, but we have people, of course, from academia. We have people that are coming from the social sciences. We have people coming from the regulatory legal background. So it is very encouraging to see that upfront the standards experts that are building these are reflecting what's happening in the real world, where it's not just the people on the development side. The last question was on sort of reduction of fragmentation. I completely agree with the comments from Diane that it's very important to continue collaboration. I think there was a theme in the comments that I made earlier, which is, we do not develop IT standards in vacuum. We have to do that with the idea that these will then be adapted into a particular domain. And of course, AI itself may be new and we have to deal with that piece, but it's part of a larger ecosystem that will be used, whether it's in a medical area or a smart factory. Just two quick examples. We are collaborating with a committee in IEC on functional safety, and we just recently approved a joint working group on AI-enabled health informatics. So those are just examples of how we work with other established committees to be able to help them get to where they want to do with AI. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wael. Thank you for that interesting answer. And now, Chad, over to you for your answer. Thank you very much.
So to Eric's question about what you could be doing in prodding. So I'm an empirical economist, believe in data and analysis, but I'm also, I guess, partly now a storyteller. And so to kind of help to explain the world, what we learn out of economic analysis, I think it's important to take that to heart. And so I was excited about the discussion in the earlier session on the case studies that are kind of coming out to illustrate some of the contributions that are being made in this space. And so in response to your question, I said if I were to do 3 trade talks episodes on some issues that kind of come up, here are the ones that came to mind that kind of show the problems that arise, how they can be resolved, that kind of thing. So first, the recent baby formula issue in the United States, right? Clearly good and bad on the regulatory side. Yay, regulations to identify that was a problem at that plant. Boo, regulations that we hadn't sort of FDA authorized enough plants abroad so that we were able to divert sourcing to other places when that challenge popped up, right? That can sort of show the trade-offs and why the need for trade and cooperation and flexibility. Cooperation, can either head off problems before they happen, or when maybe they inevitably happen, how you resolve them relatively quickly. Second, in the vaccine story, right? The United States, undertold story, we had a plant that completely botched vaccine production. It had to be shut down for 4 or 5 months. Just up the street from where I am here in Washington, in Baltimore, that was manufacturing the Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca vaccines. Would have been a huge, huge nightmare, horror story, but for the fact that we had diversification and there were these other vaccines, the Pfizer and the Moderna, but also if the Johnson & Johnson was going to be the one that we had gone with, that we had diversification through the plant that was producing it in Europe, right? So telling that story would be useful as well. Finally, the last one I can come up with was in the PPE space, part of the Chinese story, massive production and export response eventually when the world needed it and couldn't stand up its own suppliers in time. Now, there wasn't enough in February and March in Europe and the United States, but eventually over the course of the rest of the year, trade was hugely beneficial. But then we ran into challenges on counterfeit products. And so the Chinese government sort of stepped in with this new, at the border export quality control checks, right? To try to help maintain the reputation of its industry and to help improve qualities, even though the priority was obviously on just getting volumes as much as we possibly could out there to the world. So there's these trade-offs here. There's case studies, I think, that need to be told to help us understand the real work that's being done at the WTO in this area and how it can be done better in future.
Thank you very much, Chad, for those remarks. And I think there are quite a few of us, both in the room and online, that are big fans of your Trade Talks podcast. So keep them coming, please. And unfortunately, we have run out of time. we have to close this session, but I would like to do so by first thanking all of our speakers for their valuable insights. Indeed, you have really provided us plenty of food for thought in key policy areas being discussed in the TBT committee. So thank you very much. And I would also like to thank our audience, both in the room and online, for your engagement and your attention. So before, now that I'm closing, I would like to hand over and give the floor to the head of the TBT unit at the WTO, Eric Wickstrom, for some final concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. I know I'm keeping you from breakfast, some of you, and lunch here and perhaps dinner elsewhere. But our Deputy Director General Pogam asked me to say just a very few closing remarks. And I'm somewhat torn because on the one hand, we have been called boring, not sexy, overlooked. But on the other hand, from the early notes this morning, clearly, and we are onto something. I think the Tbt Committee and the background in the agreement clearly has a very important role with respect to transparency, with respect to dispute prevention. I think we are able to, through our committee, also help make sure that the regulation does not happen in silos, that we have good regulatory practices across the board, and also to some extent promote the notion that we should not have too much fragmentation in standard setting. So I think all these, what we are about, there's a lot of positive stories to be told. And I think those deliverables, as were put in the morning by our DDG, can be characterized as ongoing. That this is one area that the WTO delivers on, in a sense, a third pillar that complements what is negotiations, as well as the formal dispute settlement. So it's another area of work that I think we need to get better at promoting and showing what we do. So Chad, I do look forward to the trade talks and your ways of doing that, because I think storytelling is part of the issue. Finally, I think it leaves me at least with two questions. So one, I think we need to look at better the economics and the stories in terms of how we quantify the benefits of multilateral cooperation in the regulatory sphere. And I think we have seen some good efforts from the EU, and on our side, we have also managed to quantify some issues, but I think we need to get better at that. And it's an open question and challenge to young and bright minds, and maybe some older ones too, in terms of how can we do this better in the future. Our second question is more for us in the TBT committee and the delegations who are online, in terms of how, I think on the notification side, the story is very positive. We have a very good record in the WTO. And we also have good tools, EPing. And on SDCs, it takes a lot of our time. And this is something that I think members and delegations cherish. They use this, but how can we become more efficient in showing the benefits of it? It's slightly connected to the first issue. So how can we become more efficient in the discussion of SDCs in the committee? And that's a question that we might want to come back to in the more formal committee context, but I think it's also coming up in the general reform discussions now at the WTO. So with those questions and those remarks, I wish you a happy World Standards Day, which someone actually told me it is today. A good weekend and bon appetit. Thank you.
Thank you.